Hello and welcome to Thanatos TV. My introduction to this studio conversation will be short. Jennifer Neo is the host and I am her interviewee. The year 2024, the 10th year of Thanatos TV, and a look back on the project led to my decision to, so to speak, switch sides in front of the camera. We thought that some of our viewers would be interested in how and by what motivations Thanatos TV came to be, and perhaps also what so many conversations with near-death or death researchers do to the interviewer himself. Have fun.
Good day, Mr. Huema. I'm pleased to welcome you to Studio F. I already had the pleasure of speaking with Mr. Mehmet Yesilgöz, and now I have you as another founding member of Thanatos in front of the camera. Thanatos is celebrating its 10th anniversary, and for this occasion, I'd like to ask you how you came up with the idea of creating this special channel.
It was originally a book and film project. As a journalist, as an author, I had dealt several times with worldview-related questions and worked together with the Complete Media publisher in Grünwald, Germany. We had a book project with the title Unsterblich, meaning immortal, and ending with a question mark and exclamation mark. That was my first contact with a near-death experiencer. It was the first interview for this project, where I spoke to someone who had had a near-death experience. It was also the first film project where I spoke to a near-death experience researcher, Pim van Lommel. I noticed that I was very interested in the subject, very enthusiastic. For me, it was an initial spark to do something that was solely about giving a forum to people who have experienced something like this. On the other hand, it was also a forum for people who deal with it scientifically, because a real scientific discussion on the subject rarely takes place. Mehmet had the same intention, the same idea. We then split up the work a bit. I took care of the YouTube channel and the establishment of the channel. He developed a homepage because we also wanted to accompany it with text contributions, which can be read. That was the starting point, about 10 years ago.
Very nice. That means you already had a personal interest in worldview-related topics and consciousness research. So you wanted to create a channel for this topic.
Yes, I had been interested in worldview-related topics for as long as I can remember. I was a bit of a special case in my youth. I spent my puberty years more with philosophical discussions with friends than in a disco. That was always a personal interest of mine. I also had a religious connection, to put it in this way, but not in the sense of being shaped by my parents or a church. It was something that was simply there. It also led to a search in various spiritual and religious communities. It was there from the start, for sure. At that time, when the book was written, it was also about consciousness research, because that's a topic we talk about as a matter of course. And if you look closer, there is very little knowledge about it.
The difficult questions around consciousness are still open. It has not yet been explained in great detail how consciousness, self-awareness, can arise in a person's life due to the well-observed processes of cognition.
Exactly.
Has there been a change for you in your worldview, in your feelings, or in your attitude? Are you now sure that there is an afterlife, after you had spoken to so many people who have had near-death experiences? Has that changed anything?
Yes, I think so. From my life experience, it has always been clear to me that there is more than the material world. But I have also tended to stick to certain spiritual concepts, because that's the easiest way. You want to know something, you hear from people who have experienced something, or had a revelation that suddenly announces what the world beyond looks like in detail. Of course, it's very pleasant to have that feeling, to have an overview. But in the end, it has always been something very individual, something that touched my faith, and also the terms that were associated with it. What do you understand by God? What do you understand by spirit? What is that? Definitions. In various spiritual directions, you can find definitions, terms that often contradict
each other.
And for me, the change was that through these conversations, through people who have experienced something themselves, there was an important change. I have come away from word-oriented concepts, concepts that are described with words, because the experience was that one person describes it with these words, another describes it with these words. One says, I have experienced divinity, I have stood before God. The other says, I have been in the spiritual light, I have been enlightened. There are different terms, but when you talk to many people, you get the impression that they all speak of the same thing. Everyone expresses it with the words that represent this indescribable experience for them. And I have come away from words more and more, and thus also from certain structures of how you imagine worlds. But at the same time, I have understood and realized more about the feelings of what people are really experiencing. I think the ability to experience these feelings with them has become greater. I feel more independent, freer, more open to different explanations, more curious, without wanting to throw away anything from my previous biography.
That means you've gone further, directly behind the words, so to speak, and have tried to fulfill the core of the message.
The experiences of human beings.
The experience of humans, exactly. And one must not forget that one has to do with something fundamentally indescribable, which is very difficult to grasp in words. Words are always just a means to translate these experiences.
We don't have the words for it.
Exactly, and that is said again and again. I'm glad that you were able to take this with you personally and can have a deeper experience with the human beings themselves.
It is also said that near-death experiences are like a good-natured virus. And I also experience this in the comments that reach us through YouTube, especially through YouTube, that people say that it does something to them when they look at such reports. And I think it is very important to get away from the all-too-concrete, from all-too-concrete ideas about what, for example, the afterlife is, how it goes on. Because what is experienced there is really indescribable and really very different from what we can experience in the physical world. Words are simply missing to describe it. And when words are used, they are always just means, crutches, to make the incomprehensible a little more understandable. But the important thing is not to get stuck in words.
I find it particularly beautiful in this context that there are still generally valid, beautiful core statements in near-death experiences and other spiritual experiences that remain consistent beyond the words. There are core statements, such as the unending love, this unconditional love, complete acceptance, which is often a great contradiction to our experience here on Earth, that certain things that seem important to us in life are not so important, that other things are crucial.
Yes, that is really an interesting aspect. Because, superficially, one would say, everyone tells it with their own words. Everyone tells their own story. This may also suggest that near-death experiences are somehow constructed from the brain and in the brain. But it's not like that. It's really just the language that makes many supposed differences. The core elements of the experience are always the same. And for me, when you deal with the subject of consciousness research, or consciousness in general, that is a very exciting question. What does it mean when people in near-death situations or in other situations experience something similar, something absolutely comparable? Some say elements. What does that mean for our worldview? In my view, near-death experiences are really a challenge for consciousness research. And that is precisely why I think it is so important to give space to scientific research on these experiences. Because, first of all, there are not many researchers, whether they are doctors, psychologists, philosophers, who go deep into the subject at all. It is often explained away. Well, near-death experiences are somehow produced from the dying brain. You notice in many conversations, in many interviews on the subject, that it is always more about the attempt to maintain a certain worldview, to promote, to support it through near-death experiences, than to really look at it free from bias and ask what is behind it. And for me, journalistically, this is also a very important approach, that you don't play the Trojan horse, so to speak. I use near-death experiences as an attractive vehicle and actually want to sell some kind of worldview with it. No, and that really shouldn't be the case with Thanatos. It should offer people a completely neutral forum to talk about it, and to really give scientists who are interested in the subject the opportunity to present their results.
That means your goal here was not to confirm a worldview, not necessarily to contradict it either, but on the one hand to give people the forum to talk about it. One must not forget in the whole discussion that this has serious consequences for the affected, and that it takes a lot of processing to deal with an experience like that. So on the one hand, it is a forum for people, and on the other hand, a neutral collection of experiences, so that you can better understand near-death experiences as a whole.
Yes, that is a very important aspect you've mentioned. You often read in reactions, "Oh, if only I had a near-death experience, then I would know more about the world beyond." That may be an aspect. It is, of course, a certain insight into an incredible experience that, for most people, has an impact on the rest of their lives. But for most people, it is above all a trauma. They find no way to reconcile this incredible experience, which they cannot put into words, with their everyday life. One would have to put it the other way around, to reconcile their everyday life with this experience. It is simply incredibly difficult. I hear that again and again, and it is of course nice to hear that a channel like Thanatos is a help for many, because they see that there are many others who have experienced something similar, because they also see that there are people, many people, even scientists, who are really serious about the subject, who don't just say, "Well, you're a bit of an oddball," or something similar. So it is really helpful for many to recognize that what they have experienced, certain elements, many others have also experienced. And then to believe in themselves, in the authenticity of it, because many really start to question themselves.
I think it is also because it is so difficult to accept near-death experiences or other spiritual experiences that confirm these basic messages. I think it's very difficult to accept them because it would mean in the long run that our worldview, the way it exists now, can no longer stand. It would have far-reaching consequences. I think that the resistance of science also comes from this, because if you accept that, materialism is also put a bit into question. What I find a pity about this is that if you really deal with the many near-death experiences, you can easily see that it would not be logical that a dying person whose body either really has a heart attack or is just dying or has already died and has to be reanimated should produce such a deep experience, that the brain has the capacity to deal with the deepest inner things during a heart attack, sometimes including a life review with the perspective of others. So, if you accept the near-death experience, the weight of it, then it's actually not that easy to find a way to push it away.
I found it very interesting in this context what Pim van Lommel, a Dutch death researcher, originally pushed. With his studies on a few hundred patients who had a cardiac arrest and were considered clinically dead, he actually tried to find all the conventional explanations, such as oxygen deficiency in the brain or the release of the body's own pharmacological agents, psychological explanations such as a protective mechanism that should prevent fear of death, etc. He examined these conventional explanations one after the other and was actually able to exclude them as explanations for near-death experiences, because he saw that the explanation only applies under very specific circumstances for very few people, but by far not for everyone. And there is no explanation that is based on the materialistic basis that really shows this diversity and also the course and content, the quality and the effects of such near-death experiences. And that's why it's a challenge, of course.
Near-death experiences are even referred to as hyper-real. Fittingly, you wrote a book, Immortal: Good Reasons for Life After Death, in which you actually address this problem. Because both near-death experiences and consciousness experiences cannot be explained completely. Consciousness is a riddle, and the quality of perceptions increases during near-death experiences. How can it be explained that the experience is perceived as hyper-real? Can you put that into context?
Near-death experiences lead to very basic questions. Namely, how do we experience at all? If you suppose that near-death experiences are produced by the brain, then you assume that experience takes place in the brain.
Produced in the brain.
And this is hardly questioned. But you can ask the naive question, well, what is experiencing at all? What is this ability to perceive the world in terms of feelings in a qualitative way? I can perceive hopes, longing, love, all these inner qualities that make us human, that constitute being human, without which we would not feel like humans and would not consider life to be worth living. I can't quantify all these qualities. I can't measure them. I can't weigh them. They don't fit into the materialistic worldview at all. And that's why this question of how a firework of neurons under the skull, brain activity, how is it supposed to lead to this quality of experience?
That's exactly the problem, the hard problem of consciousness.
Exactly.
How can cognitive processes produce a higher order self?
That we can observe.
A higher level of perception, a higher level of feeling, thinking, and assessing. I suppose that in the case of near-death experiences, it is very quickly, well, that's what the brain does when depleted from oxygen, during oxygen deficiency, although it is already clear that only a certain percentage of near-death experiences take place under the condition of oxygen deficiency, and that this is not a basic condition at all. I think that it is often said that this experience has to be produced in the brain, because in general it is claimed that consciousness is generated in the brain. Now you have to argue in this way in order to maintain this worldview, but in truth, both qualities are not reconcilable.
Yes, it is not at all understandable how experiences emerge from neural activity. There is a gap that no one can explain. You can explain when you look at each other how the stimuli come to the eye, what the optic nerve transmits, where it enters the brain, how these islands of the present are produced. You can understand a lot of neurology. But this point, how from this we experience, this quality that we experience in every second, that we take for granted as our life, we can't explain that. And if you ask on this basis, what is experience at all, then you come to other definitions of consciousness. Then this experience and consciousness have nothing to do with the brain. And this is exactly what near-death experiences point to. And then there is a theory which Pim van Lommel also expresses, that if such experiences of clinically dead people show that experiences are possible at a time with absolute certainty no consciousness-forming functions can take place in the brain, if it is clear that consciousness outside the body is possible without brain functions, and this is what the experiences point to, then the question arises, what are the differences? What can consciousness be at all if it is not connected to the body? And then we come to the term hyperreality, for example, which you mentioned, because near-death experiencers report that they suddenly experienced a reality that is much more intense, closer to life, more real than real. As you say, much more intense than they have ever experienced in the body, so that their whole life seems like a dream to them. And that is the problem. They have awoken to a state where they have perceived the world in a completely different way, more intense, more alive, more loving, in a completely different quality, and now should be able to cope with this state of the body without ever being able to forget it again.
To cope with it.
They are longing to experience this state again, which often has very intense effects that can be problematic. If you will, the bright sides are at the same time the dark sides of such an experience. So it's not only easy and beautiful to have such an experience, but also a huge challenge.
And I believe that especially through a channel like Thanatos, there is a higher level of acceptance. Other people who have had such experiences may identify with your interviewees, and a platform has been created where people can speak openly about it, which is of course very, very important.
Yes, openness is also a big concern for me, because I have the impression that especially in the English-speaking world, near-death experiences are very often sold as a vehicle to convey a worldview.
There have even been near-death experiences that were constructed by church communities, where within the near-death experience, people were reminded of the obligation to confess.
I don't know of that, but I can imagine it very well.
Yes, there have been some examples. Of course, you have to be careful. But I think what I noticed is that it often resonates very deeply when you hear these things, as if you would already know it or somehow identify with it, regardless of whether you had an experience or not. I think the truths that are presented there and the similarities touch people. That's what I noticed.
Interestingly, it touches people directly. You don't need any mediation through any worldview, through any church, through any dogma, through an idea of how it all works. It is very often the case that near-death experiencers say, yes, the faith that I had in the church or in a religious community has truths to it. But in the end, it is just a low-quality crutch compared to what really is. A kind of spirituality deepens what is always very direct. And everything that religious knowledge wants to convey in certain forms, in certain cults, in certain dogmas, then loses its meaning.
Human regulations, for example, or social rules, or a certain worldview. Homosexuality, for example, such things are not an issue at all. I found it particularly valuable in this channel that one has the possibility to personally filter out the core statements based on various reports. There are certain things that always repeat themselves. For this reason, I also assumed that these experiences cannot be produced in the brain. If people are confronted with the same very deep elements when beyond their physical condition due to an accident or some other severe impairment, and nevertheless similar images were described, the re-entry into the body is described similarly. For this reason, I personally find the channel particularly great.
You were also someone who was very skeptical towards anything non-materialistic. And because of your own experience, you were almost forced to let go of your previous worldview.
It took me a particularly long time because the experience itself had an impact on me, but I would never have talked to others about it. I came from a scientific background and would probably have become an atheist. I was very young, but it went in this direction. And because of this experience, I had to deal with it. It only became true 16 years later. But the real breakthrough, the real acceptance that the probability is greater that there is no such death as we imagine, this end, this black nothingness, actually came through this channel, because I then realized that it was the same for many other people, and they described similar things. And this similarity, this comparison of different cases, allows for a worldview. Do you allow yourself to create a picture, a construct of the afterlife based on the experiences you heard of?
Yes and no. Yes, I have one for myself, but it is in a permanent transformation. And no, because it is really difficult to express it with words. I'm often overwhelmed when someone asks me to explain in a minute what the afterlife looks like, how it all fits together. Just because I experience and feel that if I use a term, it won't be taken by others the way I would like it to be taken, or the way I see it. Because everyone has their own worldview. That means everything you want to convey with language, to a certain extent, fails in terms of language itself. You would have to clarify terms endlessly and agree that you're talking about the same thing. And in this respect, it is really difficult. Yes, but in short, for me, the most beautiful image is still this triad of spirit, soul, and body. I assume that the core of our being is something spiritual, and that this is ultimately also the nature of consciousness. It is nothing material. It is simply there as a spiritual entity. And I believe that this spirit is characterized by qualities. It is space and timeless. I don't think it has anything to do with temporal processes as we know them here, or with spatial separation as we know it. I believe that what we experience as empathy, or in shared near-death experiences, where one experiences exactly what another person experiences in death, or in general, what near-death experiences report, that the ability to experience empathy generally becomes greater, that in a life review they not only experience their own situation, but also the life of others involved, as if they were these others. So, this connection with everything in creation, not only with fellow humans, but in general with everything that is. I believe that this belongs to the nature of this great comprehensive spirit. And also what one calls light, love, and so on. I believe that this is the original quality of the spiritual, our own home.
Which is often referred to as home.
One might ask, why is this expressed in a near-death experience? I believe that these are special elements that people probably need, who experience this with all the problems and tasks associated with it. And I see it primarily as how one can have other special experiences in life. When someone experiences true love and experiences this resonance, this is also incredibly motivating, inspiring, and gives a real impulse. Also, the love for a child. Simply this closeness to life. And I believe that near-death experiences may also have this purpose, to be connected with the origin, with one's own origin, with the spiritual, with the big picture, in a special way.
This is interesting because this is based on dying.
Yes.
Dying then leads back to the origin. You said that there is a spiritual level. There's also the concept of the soul. How does the soul fit into this?
I believe that the soul is formed from the spiritual. My personal interpretation is based on the big question, why do we even experience the physical world when there is the great spiritual world, with light, love, and so on? I believe that it is all about development. I believe, my image is that there is an area in the spiritual world which has all kinds of potential, like a plant which is beautiful and just is. But it also produces seeds which store development potential. And I believe that just as the seed of a plant is put into the earth, and then it develops with sunshine and rain, in the same way, if you will, spiritual seeds, which come from the great spiritual world, go through a developmental process. And I believe that this development process also fulfills a purpose for the big picture. Because everything that is generated here by experiencing, also by troublesome experiencing, ultimately serves to further and intensify consciousness. So, I believe it is about a development process, and for this development, a soul forms from the spiritual, or many countless souls, which go through a development process.
By incarnating.
Which probably not only, but also leads to the physical world. I could imagine that other worlds, as described by mediums, also serve the development of the soul. By that stage, so to speak, the total maturity is achieved, and this development process is completed, and everything then returns to the origin of the spiritual. But a part of this spiritual development process is probably also life on Earth.
You talked about the spiritual, the light, the highest level, which as a second stage then produces a soul, and which then inhabits the body in the third stage.
Yes, the body is the third stage, and that is what we know or believe we know. And I believe that this totality results in exactly what we experience here. For instance, we have the inner voice. And with the inner voice, there is not only one voice that you hear, but there are several voices. And I believe that, for example, when it comes to the satisfaction of needs, there are impulses that come from the body, which are ultimately also biological, which control us, hunger, whatever, which control us and serve for survival. Then there are impulses that come from the soul. These are all the things we have to process.
Or that have to do with experience. If you say that the soul is the vehicle to enable experience,
exactly,
to be in love, interests, hobbies, urges, to experience something.
And all these spiritual problems are associated with it. For example, sadness, the handling of life situations in general, which then have an effect on our mental state. There is also this large spectrum of problems of the soul that one seeks to treat with therapies. So these are the spiritual aspects. But then there is a third level, and that is, if you look at the inner voice, the quietest of all inner voices, the voice of conscience, in my view, comes from the innermost, from the spiritual.
The way you describe it, that seems very familiar to me. We all know these inner conflicts, which can sometimes result from these three needs.
Yes, and we experience this wholeness and have to deal with it. And this is also a task, and often associated with a difficulty, to see this correctly. And I think it would be important for the life of every person to give this quiet, innermost voice more hearing. Because that is also the voice that really connects us with our fellow human beings, with the environment, with everything that makes sense in our lives. So this purpose orientation of the human being also comes from the spiritual. These are the inner struggles that arise from this. We have a body, and this body is a product of evolution. Just as our brain works, it is ultimately a product of evolution. Our brain is programmed to survive. So all the impulses that come from the brain, this desire for advantage that is exploited by advertising, the hunt for a good deal, and so on, these are all biological survival strategies. Also, this self-centeredness before thinking of others, this selfishness. These are all things that have their origin, in my view, in bodily impulses. And in contrast to this is our innermost essence, with which we also have the possibility to review grief or other difficulties.
The highest perspective that we know sometimes offers the possibility to see sometimes terribly painful things from a different perspective, to see a meaning behind them.
And this spirituality also gives us the possibility to gain something from every difficult situation. The question is often asked, why am I experiencing this now? Why is it happening to me? Why do I still have to do this? And so on. I then always have to think of Viktor Frankl, who said you can also see all the situations that you experience as a call. And the question is then always, how do I respond to it? Life offers me situations, difficult, pleasant, and I respond to them. And I think this possibility, which answer do I give, how do I use what life offers me in situations, that's where the spiritual comes into play, in this possibility to decide how I use it. And I think that, in the end, this is where free will lies.
Inside.
Inside, how we react to situations in life. whether we decide to profit from an experience in order to reach a goal, whether we use it or we don't. So there is also a final inner possibility to decide. And I think the essence of free will also lies not so much in the possibility to shape the world from the outside. I think the situations in life that we come into, that sometimes seem so predetermined, are a consequence of such inner decisions. Which paths I take based on earlier situations.
Attitudes, feelings.
Based on my attitude.
Attitude. I think that's a very good word for it. That means free will is how I deal with these things, with the questions of life. There are events that I have to face, and my free will is the freedom to deal with them in one way or another. And the soul you see as a kind of vehicle that carries into these events in order to make development possible.
Exactly.
We chemically know what happens when you fall in love. You don't choose it. That means the soul, the origin, carries us there. You can't trigger it with a push of a button just because you have a cocktail of chemicals.
The cocktail of chemicals is the body. The soul leads me, and the spirit decides what I use this possibility for. What do I make of it? That's the spiritual guidance that can lead me to the next events.
In the end, one could say that the events that come to you are no longer purely coincidental, but they depend on which questions are asked, how one reacts to them. That means it's no longer purely coincidental what happens when situations are created from the outside, or the soul carries you to the experiences.
There are hidden backgrounds. But from my point of view, there is less direct interaction where you say, I want this from the universe, and then the situation comes back. No, the situation I experience is created due to an attitude. And there is also work behind that. When we speak of body, soul, spirit, we live in this triad. And that's how all the necessities of life arise. That's, broadly put, my overall picture. And that's why I would assume, while remaining completely open to what may be the true world view, I'm someone who believes that the origin of everything is not matter from which consciousness develops, but actually the spiritual is consciousness itself, from which, due to a need for development, the whole material world arises.
That would have been my next question. What existed first? Consciousness or matter? In this case, the spirit is, say, the fundamental consciousness that grows, is creative, wants to develop, can create an infinite number of possibilities from which a soul is formed as a vehicle to ultimately help matter become alive.
Yes, and also to bring out the potential that is in the soul, inside the spiritual seed, to make possible the development of this potential. In nature, there is never only one purpose. There is always a network from which ultimately everything benefits. That's how life works. There is never only one island that develops for itself and everything else is excluded from it. It's always about the big picture, because everything comes from the big picture. But, as I said, I always keep in mind how good it really is when you draw such a conclusion. When I draw a conclusion, I also am aware of my own focus, of what I see as essential, what I see as important, and what changes with my own development. The problem is, when you draw a conclusion, you work with language, so that things are written down. And with that, this big, living thing, which everyone experiences differently, and which also means something different for everyone, is always focused on a structure that may bring with it a certain danger. I understand this need. I also have a need to draw a picture and draw a conclusion. But it's also a dangerous thing, because in the end, you can't do it.
Yes, I agree. I have to agree with you. Especially with conclusions, I always see a certain danger in turning the picture we have of something into stone. That's how it is, and then there's no movement anymore. You can't avoid it anymore because you say, that was the conclusion we came to, and in that case, it's very difficult.
And that's also where a certain spiritual trap lies. In the sense that I think it's important for everyone to have something to hold on to have an inner picture, a worldview, an idea of faith, a certain idea of what happens after death. Religions are very good at delivering fixed images, and many also need this. I don't want to say it's bad, but the problem is, as soon as you cling to a fixed image, you automatically exclude a lot of other things. I have one point of view, but I don't allow others, because I think I have the truth as I see it with the concepts I have. I exclude everything else. It can easily lead to fanaticism. The attitude toward my image is more important than openness, than being a fellow human being.
In the spiritual realm, there are the same dangers as in science, where everything is pressed into one concept.
Especially when someone has a crisis, it's often the case that they look for something that gives them stability. Then they find a spiritual concept that appeals to them, which also appeals to them internally. They accept it, hold on to it, but don't realize that it excludes a lot, because they only cling to the concept. For me, that's a certain danger. There's also a fear behind it. When I have created an image that I believe in and start to question it, what's going to happen to me? Do I still have something to hold on to? The fear that the rug will be pulled out from under me is very big. But on the other hand, I can say from my own experience that a healthy skepticism and an openness to accept it could be different. I've only experienced a tiny part of the truth. Being aware that you're on your way, not yet at your destination. If you have the courage to acknowledge this uncertainty, that leads to a greater freedom. And also frees you from prisons of faith that can arise if you cling to a certain concept, a certain dogma.
Humanity has had to do this many times. In history, we've had the situation where the existing worldview was that the Earth is flat. It was always clear that the processes up to general acceptance were relatively long. It was difficult to suddenly throw away these finished concepts. No, it's true, the Earth is round. It was very, very difficult. And I don't think this has changed. And it still is a difficulty.
I like the expression of serious scientists who say, we ascend by erring. This awareness in science that we don't have the absolute truth. Sometimes it is said that scientists always present the truth. Someone who does open research would never present something as a fact. He can only say, this is our theory. And if an observation contradicts the theory, then the theory must be questioned. This awareness that we do not have the ultimate truth, but are only on the way to it, is as important in science as it is in spirituality. As you said, it's the same there. You often cling to a certain picture, want to maintain it, and hide everything else that seems to contradict it. No, that doesn't have to be true. You have a certain idea of what the spirit can do, what telepathy can do, whatever. It's the same in the spiritual field. Then something happens that completely contradicts it. And then it's also about having this openness. Well, maybe it's just a belief. Maybe it's just a crutch. Maybe it's quite different. And if you allow that, you may get a broader perspective and at some point realize it wasn't that wrong, but I only saw a tiny part of it. And I think maturity and development always lie in seeing a little more of the big picture. You always believe you know something. You believe you know something all the more when you see a small detail. And the more you really see of the whole, the more the belief of knowing it all is lost.
The claim is lost. You're right. Sometimes you have the feeling that the more you see of the detail, the closer you are to the truth. But often, it's really a broader perspective and an openness to contradiction that brings us closer to the truth. Based on your experiences and what you've heard, are you still afraid of death?
I'm not afraid of a big, unknown black hole. I'm convinced that consciousness persists. Of course, part of death is always the process of death. It can be very unpleasant. You don't know what age brings, how you approach this transition. But I'm more driven by a certain hopefully healthy curiosity. What it will be like, how it really turns out. Fortunately, I don't have this longing that the near-death experiencers have, to experience this as soon as possible. I like to live, and I'm happy to be able to do something with this project that might be meaningful for others. It's a very fulfilling project that I'd like to do for a few more years. But, and I am sometimes asked about this, it's not a fear of death at all that drives me to do this project.
And it's also not a near-death experience. It's not a fear. It's an interest.
And the experience through the interviews. It's incredibly exciting to get to know the worlds of people in front of the camera, to be allowed to ask questions. It's something very beautiful. These recordings are always very exhausting. If you do 2 interviews a day and drive a few hundred kilometers, it's just exhausting, especially when you get older. But on the other hand, it's always something almost like a vacation, because you're completely away from your own everyday life. You immerse yourself in new worlds, and you always experience an expansion of your own point of view. You feel inspired by what someone else experiences. In this respect, it's something very fulfilling.
Beautiful. In the past 10 years of Thanatos, have you noticed a change in the topic? Do people approach these topics differently? What does the future bring?
I'm not so sure about that. In some interviews, I get the impression that it's become much easier. And that's what a lot of people say. And over the decades since the start of death research, let's say over the last 50 years, it's become much easier to talk about these topics, to find people who are interested in them. Scientists, psychological support. That has changed. It might further change in the future. It could become even easier because we're creating more and more near-death experiences through medical interventions. More and more people are being brought back to life. And of course, this increases the number of documented near-death experiences all over the world. On the other hand, there's the question of how science deals with this. And I get the impression that we're not progressing. There have been so many findings that are documented, and well documented, that I get the impression that they've been forgotten, and you start all over again. The explanations for near-death experiences that we hear today about the role of the frontal lobe or DMT or something like that already existed 30 years ago. They've been thoroughly disproven. It's been documented, but somehow it hasn't got through. This idea that consciousness is a product of matter is still very much present. And sometimes I get the impression that when you look at the developments of AI or science fiction literature, it's no longer being questioned. It's taken for granted that consciousness will soon be transferred to machines and then we'll be immortal.
And that even though we can't explain consciousness at all. We don't know anything about it. We can't explain near-death experiences, let alone normal day-to-day consciousness. I think that's why explanatory attempts in both areas are going around in circles. And there was never one that was not attributed to matter.
And I find that exciting. Because on the one hand, if you separate artificial intelligence from consciousness, which is probably not so easy to produce artificially, if you separate them, clearly it's interesting to see what all of a sudden becomes possible. Areas where we thought human creativity was crucial are now suddenly being taken over by machines.
That's right. It's quite amazing that you can produce a product with artificial intelligence through computing processes. For example, a melody. But you mustn't forget that consciousness becomes creative because of a completely different background process. It can be sadness, love, a feeling, an experience that inspires to create a song.
So there's a spontaneous process that has to be calculated by the machine.
In the end, we have two melodies, but artificial intelligence can't replace consciousness in this sense, because consciousness has other background processes. Life, even if both products can be considered a melody.
Yes, you can't really tell the difference because of the product, but the process behind it is completely different. And I hope that at some point, the point will come where we see that the essence of consciousness hasn't been grasped by technical developments or by neuroscience and medicine. And that would be a hope for the future, that through near-death experiences or similar experiences and related research, there will be a breaking point where we admit that if we want to recognize the essence of consciousness, then we have to start somewhere else.
Beyond matter. Maybe that's the point when we have to accept to a certain degree that consciousness is not describable with the means we have up to now.
And I don't see this path at the moment. We are very deep in materialism.
They will probably try desperately for a long time. Thank you very much for the great conversation and the background information on how this fascinating channel came to be. Thank you very much.
I also thank you for the collaboration. It was a great conversation for me too. Thank you very much.
Thank you.